Our service members were being taught that the most important or critical threats to national security that we faced were global climate change, COVID-19, and white supremacy. If you're thinking, give me a break, well, that's what the preponderance of our military service members were thinking as well. It's just a distraction. Well, that distraction unfortunately had consequences later, politically speaking, in our withdrawal from Afghanistan, in our withdrawal in 2021. And it's had further consequences that I'll talk about more in the show in the future. Back on Thanksgiving of 2020, I had the opportunity to chat with President Trump in a Thanksgiving video conference that he did with representative units across the Defense Department. Take a look.
From the United States Space, and this is a very important thing to me, the Space Force, because it's 75 years since the Air Force. This is the first one, new branch. The United States Space Force, we're joined by Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Lohmeier and the 11th Space Warning Squadron, that sounds great, at Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado. You keep watch around the world to detect missile launches, space launches, and nuclear detonations while providing critical intelligence. All of you are pioneers in the newest branch of our armed forces. And again, it's very special to me, that new branch, because that was something that I felt was necessary. And I never said it during a campaign. I said it after I became president. I saw what was happening with China and Russia and others. And it's really something, so we're very proud of it. So now we're going to a special place in my heart, Space Force, because nobody even thought about Space Force. And I looked at it and I said, we're going to have to come up, we're going to have to do something, because I looked at what China was doing and Russia was doing, and others are thinking about doing. And I want to just thank you very much. Is Matt there? Matt?
Mr. President, good afternoon and happy Thanksgiving. This is Lieutenant Colonel Matt Lohmeier, commander of the 11th Space Warning Squadron. You can't see everyone in the room, but we've got a number of others here. Grateful for the opportunity to wish you and the First Lady a happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
And also want to thank you. You've already said what we do, which is provide strategic and theater missile warning for the nation and our allies. But want to thank you personally for your advocacy for an independent Space Force so that that could become a reality while we serve. We're very grateful for that. We're making great progress that I don't think we were able to necessarily make while we belonged to the Air Force. But having our own independent service we've made great progress already in the first year. So thank you for your advocacy for that. And on behalf of all of the missile warning operators here at the 11th Space Warning Squadron, we say happy Thanksgiving.
That's good. Thank you very much, and you too. And I know the coordination with you and Air Force has been stellar. You're getting along great, and you're doing well together. And it really does work well together, but I thought that you should have separate. And as years go by and as decades go by, people will see the importance of Space Force. There's no question about it. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that the morning following that Thanksgiving video conference call with the president, newspapers that I found online were reporting things like Trump hosts Thanksgiving call with his troops, can't stop complaining about the election results, which was totally false. We spent about 4 hours in the room that day anticipating the call. The president showed up, spent about an hour with the troops, and not once did he even bring up the election, which had taken place weeks earlier and which was still pending adjudication, if you'll remember, and I'm sure everyone does. Not once did he complain about the election results with the service members who were on that call, and yet some newspapers couldn't help themselves but report that that's exactly what he did and all he did on his call with the troops. So our service members got to see firsthand just how false-spirited our media outlets can be. And we still have that problem today, and we've learned that over the past couple of years with the COVID pandemic. Well, the purpose of episode 1 of this show was to trace through and read verbatim a written formal complaint that I had filed with the Space Force Inspector General's office in November of 2020. In fact, it was just probably a week before that call with President Trump. As I said in episode 1, Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting, the 3-star who fielded that complaint, sat on that report through November, December, and January of 2020 and 2021, and I received a written response to that complaint the day after the January 6th riot. And effectively, that complaint was dismissed. And I wanted to share that publicly because I was asked by a Politico reporter, Oriana Pollock, what my reaction was to the news that the Air Force Inspector General's office had found Stephen Whiting innocent of any wrongdoing in firing me, now months later, in May of 2021, after I'd published my book, Irresistible Revolution. And I shared with her my response, and she informed me that she wasn't interested in publishing that response that I had given her, and I said I'd be sharing that on my forthcoming show, which I've done. In episode 2 now, I'd actually like to backtrack just a little bit and share about my own career and share some background on where I'd come from and how I had gotten to the point at which I was having a phone conversation with the president while in command of a Space Force unit. Because I think sharing a little bit about my career is important context for what I plan to share to finish up this short series in episode 3 about what happens after I'm fired. So I'll be brief, but want to trace my career back to USAFA, the United States Air Force Academy, as a starting point. I went there in 2000, happened to get into the school because I was good at basketball, better at basketball than I was academically in high school, and was recruited to play basketball at the Air Force Academy. Had the best games of my life in high school, probably when the Air Force recruiters came to watch us play. I played basketball at a high school in Tucson. In fact, Saguaro High School won the state championship my senior year and won it again the year after I'd left to go play at the Air Force Academy. Well, I played basketball at Air Force for just the first year. I was on a JV team. Before going there, I didn't know they had a JV team. But they had an A team and a B team, and I was on the B team, and we played a bunch of junior colleges around the country for that first year. Had some fun, but not enough fun to continue playing for the rest of my time at the academy. And so I stopped playing basketball, tried to start to focus on what was a very rigorous academic program there in my sophomore year. That was 2001 to 2002. And then I actually left the Air Force Academy, had to resign from the academy to serve a 2-year Mormon mission. And I went to Taiwan, lived predominantly in Taipei, the major capital city in Taiwan, but also spent 8 or 9 months in the jungle of Hualien on the east coast of Taiwan. And I should share this story because it's actually, it's a miracle. And I think you'd be interested in hearing it, and perhaps I can be put in touch with the man who helped me get back into the Air Force Academy. But I had applied to get back into the Air Force Academy about halfway through my 2-year mission in Taipei. And I was denied a nomination from congressmen and senators to get back into the Air Force Academy. Remember, the first time I got in was because I had basketball coaches pulling strings for me to get in. I was denied a nomination the first time I had applied in high school. I remember calling the basketball coaches and saying, I thought you said I was supposed to get in. And they said, oh, just give it some time. And sure enough, I gave it a couple of weeks and heard back from, I think it was Congressman Colby's office there in Arizona saying, hey, we've made a mistake. You actually do have a nomination to get back into the Air Force Academy. So that's how I got in the first time. Well, I didn't have the basketball thing going for me the second time around. In 2003 is when I had applied again. And although I had done well while I was at the academy the first time around, I was apparently competing again with all of the incoming 4 degrees or freshmen that were going to be coming to the Air Force Academy, and my SATs, ACTs, and GPA from high school simply weren't competitive. Well, the point of the story is I was walking on the street in Taipei City in the north end of Taiwan, if you're not sure where it's at, And I was probably one of the only white guys walking the streets, frankly, me and my companion. We are paired off in twos on our missions. And he was asking what my college plans were after the mission. We were speaking in English. Typically, we spoke Mandarin while we were walking the streets of Taipei. But I shared with him that I had intended to go back to the Air Force Academy, but that those plans had fallen through because I had applied for nomination to get back in, but was denied. And right when I shared that, I had a tap on my shoulder. This is the miracle that I was referring to. Someone tapped on my shoulder who overheard our conversation, and he stuck out his hand. I turned around. It was a white man, white shirt and tie. It looked like a businessman, and he was clearly American. And he stuck out his hand and said, "Gentry Stevens," I think he said 97 grad, if I'm not mistaken. "Gentry Stevens, 97 grad. Do you want to get back into the Air Force Academy?" In a moment like that, you don't dare say no. And so I said yes, even though my heart had already kind of shifted away from going back into the Air Force Academy. And he began a process with me of reaching out to whatever his contacts were, either at the Pentagon or elsewhere, to secure for me a nomination to get back into the Air Force Academy. That happened on the streets in Taipei with a random stranger who happened to overhear my conversation. When things like that happen in life, you tend to take that as a sign that you were supposed to go back to a place like the Air Force Academy. So I did. I secured the nomination with Gentry Stevens' help. And by the way, I imagine Gentry Stevens won't be listening to this right away. But if anyone happens to know how I can get in contact with Gentry Stevens, I'd like to get in touch with him and thank him for helping me get back into the Air Force Academy back then in 2003. I end up going back after my mission. I end up graduating in 2006, the class of 2006, instead of the class of 2004. I commission and go off to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. I was in an A-10 squadron there, awaiting pilot training. Later, I went to Vance Air Force Base in Oklahoma, where I went through pilot training for a year. Ended up being a T-38 student and stayed on as an instructor pilot in the T-38. Went to Pitt, the pilot instructor training course that's down in San Antonio, Texas. Came back and spent 3 years as a T-38 instructor pilot flying from the backseat. Terrific assignment. Exciting part of my career. It was during that time in Enid, Oklahoma that I was married to my wife. She moved from the glamorous Washington, D.C. and an important career out there to come join me in Enid, Oklahoma, which some of her coworkers, I think, frankly, thought was insane. And we started our life together there in Enid and ended up moving all around the globe, first with the Air Force. I ended up flying F-15C in Oregon and then at Kadena Air Base in Japan. But then after leaving Japan and transitioning out of the flying community into the space career field, we lived in places we never imagined we would, because those simply weren't options to us while I was in the flying community. We had the opportunity to be stationed once in Colorado Springs when I was the aide-de-camp for the 4-star in charge of Air Force Space Command, General J. Raymond. He's now the Chief of Space Operations for the Space Force. Had a terrific year traveling the world with General Raymond. And we're stationed twice at Buckley Air Force Base up in Denver. The first time I was there, just learning about the space-based missile warning operation and enterprise and how that works, and essentially getting my feet wet in the Air Force space community and space operations generally. But then I came back after attending various schools that the Air Force had sent me to and receiving 2 master's degrees. I came back as a commander in the Space Force, which is essentially where our story picks up in episode 1. Again, in episode 1, if you haven't listened to that episode, I'd recommend you go back and listen to episode 1. I think we've titled it "The Real Reason I Was Fired from My Command in the Space Force." Go back and listen to that formal written complaint that I had filed with the Space Force Inspector General's office while I was in command of a space-based missile warning unit for the Space Force. What will you do if the grid goes down? How will you survive without food, water, and heat? Introducing One Sunrise, the first of its kind in massive on-demand power, instantly available at any residential, commercial, or remote location. Power your home, your office, your EV, your RV, your farm, your cabin, your bug-out bunker, your glamping weekend with the family, or all of them. Bring instant power to any situation, anywhere. Non-toxic, cobalt and lead-free, as well as fire-resistant. One Sunrise mobile power stations are made to run in over 100-degree temps or at -20. For when the grid goes down, there's One Sunrise. Visit onesunrise.com to learn how you can prepare today for no power tomorrow. Well, I ended up coming back to Buckley Air Force Base for the second time to be in command of a space-based missile warning unit. It was the 11th Space Warning Squadron. It does a fantastically important mission for our country. It's one of a couple of units there at Buckley Air Force Base that do that mission. It's phenomenally important. And just like you, I had difficulty with the fact that our units were being politicized in 2020 while I was in command with a radical left-wing politicization. It was a Marxist-rooted critical race theory indoctrination and subversion of our troops that is intended to divide. And even people with the best of intentions can unfortunately get caught up in some of that critical social justice activism that, as you've seen, undermines organizations throughout the country, the education system. It has the same effect in our military, of course, and unity is the strength of our military. We talk a lot about diversity. And diversity, when properly couched or in its proper context, of course, provides a certain degree of strength in its own right. But make no mistake about it, the strength of the United States military is its unity. And that unity comes regardless of some of our differences. It comes regardless of the ways in which we pretend to be valuing diversity and inclusion today. It comes because we share the same mission. It comes because we take the same oath to support and defend the Constitution of the United States, which always was and still is worth defending. And of course, if you read the Constitution, you think, well, how is it that we swear an oath to support and defend that? I don't quite get it. Well, it has to be understood in the context of the Declaration. And the Judeo-Christian principles, roughly speaking, Judeo-Christian principles that are couched in the Declaration. I trace through some of the history of that language, by the way, in my book, Irresistible Revolution. I want service members to go in and look at these things and to figure out why it's important to them. It's not just the language of the Constitution or the document itself that you sign up to swear an oath to support and defend. It has to be understood in the context of the underlying basic assumptions about reality and the founding principles of our country that are in the Declaration. It has to be understood in the context of what was fought for and secured during the Civil War. It has to be understood in the context of what emerged in the aftermath of a civil rights movement and civil rights law. All of those things matter if you're to properly understand exactly what it is that you're signing up, and signing up you're willing to put your flesh on the line. You're willing to put blood in the game for the quote-unquote Constitution of the United States against all of its enemies, foreign and domestic. Look into it. Understand what it is that you're signing up for. You know, in that spirit or in that vein, it's why every time I had a service member reach out to me and ask if I would administer the oath of office to them or the oath of enlistment to them, I'd tell them, I'm happy to do that, but I'd like you to read the Declaration and the Constitution first. Because that's the language of the oath. We swear to support and defend the Constitution against its enemies, foreign and domestic. And believe me, despite whatever's going on in the world right now, we've got far more enemies of our republic and of our Constitution here at home than we've ever had abroad. And it is that domestic threat that I saw playing out at a breakneck pace within our armed forces while I was in command that compelled me to write that formal written complaint to the Space Force Inspector General's office in episode 1. So go back and watch episode 1 if you've not already. The real reason I was fired from my command in the Space Force. The purpose of this episode is to simply lay out for you some of the context of my own career, which I've done. It started at the Air Force Academy. I ended up in the flying community. I was medically separated from the flying community, which is what landed me in the Air Force space community. And I mentioned that I was the aide-de-camp for General Raymond, the four-star who was in charge of Air Force Space Command at the time I became his aide. I had a really unique opportunity during my time as the aide to sit in on and hear about some of the discussions incident to the creation of an independent branch of the military that we now know as the Space Force. I was a proponent or an advocate of the Space Force during that time, but there were good views on both sides of the aisle on whether we should stand up an independent branch of the military. I think there were better views from advocates for an independent branch of the military. But when I say on both sides of the aisle, I'm not necessarily speaking politically, because for a long time there was bipartisan support for the idea of the creation of an independent branch of the military for space. There was Congressman Jim Cooper, if I remember correctly, from Tennessee, Congressman Mike Rogers from Alabama, Democrat and Republican. And they were championing the idea of a Space Corps or Space Force for a number of years. This has been a popular topic among some in the Congress for a long time. It just simply took the Trump administration and his vice president, who's frankly a space nut, Mike Pence, to have the motivation and to create the political energy that was necessary to make that Space Force a reality. Well, I got to participate in those conversations as a part of my own career, or at least listen in on some of those conversations, and ended up in the school environment at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama at a time in which there was conversation and debate about the idea of a Space Force. And so I got to write about it a little bit. They were rather weak efforts, but we're all learning and growing, and I was trying my best to characterize the strengths of culture, let alone capability or budgetary reasons that were compelling for the creation of a new Space Force. The cultural implications of the creation of an independent branch of the military for space, the opportunity to forge a new way forward in space by the creation of an independent branch of the military. I got to explore some of that while I was at school. We had, or have, I would say we had a great opportunity to forge a really unique and important culture for this new service. And that is another reason why I saw what was taking place at the senior leadership levels, but also at the ground level at my own base at Buckley, so troubling to me in 2020 with all of the left-wing political activism that was afoot. We were not only disrupting the mission of our service members that is so critical to our nation, space-based missile warning, we were also disrupting a critical opportunity for the formation of a unique Space Force culture for this new branch of the military. That was all being disrupted by politics. Our service members were being taught that the most important or critical threats to national security that we faced were global climate change, COVID-19, and white supremacy. If you're thinking, give me a break, well, that's what the preponderance of our military service members were thinking as well. It's just a distraction. Well, that distraction unfortunately had consequences later, politically speaking, in our withdrawal from Afghanistan, in our withdrawal in 2021. And it's had further consequences that I'll talk about more in the show in the future. Well, where we left off in episode 1, and I'm picking back up with here now, is that my formal written complaint to the Space Force Inspector General's office was sat on through November, December, and January. None of the 24 witnesses that I had listed in that report, to my knowledge, were ever interviewed by Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting as a part of his investigation about the political activism that was afoot at my base. And I received my written response on January 7th, the day after the protest and riot at the Capitol, essentially dismissing my complaint. It was that same day that I received my written response dismissing my complaint that the subject of my complaint, the base commander, had been promoted to 1 star. In the aftermath of all of that, I was immediately determined to press forward with an idea I had had about the time that I submitted that formal written complaint, and the time I submitted that complaint was November of 2020. I was immediately determined to press forward with the writing and publishing of my book, Irresistible Revolution. The subtitle of that book is Marxism's Goal of Conquest and the Unmaking of the American Military, which is sensational, but I meant every word of that. And if you read the book, you'll understand why. But I spent the next several months writing that book in my free time, on my own dime. I was in command of a unit at the time, and I didn't inform my chain of command that I was going to write the book. And I'll say that one more time for clarity. I did not inform my chain of command that I was writing that book. I did, however, counsel with a public affairs official from the Pentagon. I did counsel with my base legal office. And I had aspects or portions of my manuscript that were being reviewed by a gaggle of attorneys throughout the country because I was interested in making sure that I was compliant with DoD regulation, with Air Force instructions. I wanted to make sure I crossed every T and dotted every I, and that I wouldn't get myself into legal trouble by publishing the book. But the story needed to be told. The story needed to be told. I've tried my best all along to preserve the identities, the privacy of the individuals involved, because for me it wasn't about vindictiveness, and I don't want to appear vindictive or petty. Although the way in which I've been treated for trying to talk about these things was cowardly and vindictive at times. In episode 3 of the podcast here, we're going to talk about what happened in the aftermath of my publishing and speaking publicly about the book. That took place in May of 2021. I hope you'll join us for episode 3. I'll talk about that. I'll talk about what I've been doing since that time and some efforts that I've currently got going on to continue to strive to protect and defend the Constitution against its enemies, foreign and domestic specifically. So please join us on episode 3. If you like the show, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or follow the show on your favorite podcasting platforms. You can also follow the show by going to MatthewLohmeier.com and clicking on the podcasting tab where the show episodes will be found there, as well as the various media outlets or platforms that you're able to subscribe on. Thanks for joining.